Morning, good afternoon, good evening. Zimbabwe is a failed state. I've said this many times and I'll say it again. And it's all because we've failed to hold free, fair, and credible elections, and therefore have failed to have a competent government. We, or rather the regime, has found all manner of excuses why Zimbabwe is a failed state. In fact, in the case of Zimbabwe, the regime is forever balancing between telling us that the economy, the future is bright, and telling us why the country so far has failed. It's always found many scapegoats, but of course, without doubt, its favorite one is blaming the West for its bad governance. Here is a video of an analysis telling us what we already know, although some of us do not want to admit it.
Early 1990s, economists had almost given up on the developing world because they were not growing as expected. Although some individual countries, like Singapore or South Korea, occasionally scaled the income ladder, the overall picture was that there was a big difference between advanced economies and the rest. Then, the scene changed. In the late 1990s, global trade experienced explosive growth, and the gap between the rich and the rest closed fast. Poverty tumbled. The share of people living on no more than $1.90 a day at purchasing power parity fell from 36% in 1990 to less than 10% in 2022. The proportion of Africans living in extreme poverty also decreased, from 53% to 35%. But due to rapid population growth, the number of poor Africans has increased. Despite this, the African economy has been among the fastest growing in the world in recent decades. Moreover, the growth in Africa is becoming increasingly hard to ignore, as rapid economic and social changes position the continent for a more significant role in global affairs. So, how are African economies doing? To answer this question, this matrix separates countries into two groups: strong growth, 5% or higher, and weak growth, less than 5%. Within each category of growth, the country's economies are further divided into three subgroups: non-resource intensive countries, oil exporters, and other resource-intensive countries. Based on growth data between 2013 and 2023, the table shows that out of the 41 countries, 18 have achieved a growth rate of 5% or higher. These countries encompass all three types of economies. While 8 out of the 18 strong growth economies are non-resource intensive countries, they are the prevailing majority. So, why are these African countries improving while others are not? For decades, commodities have shaped Africa's economic growth. When commodity prices were high, growth was good. When prices dipped, the continent's economy suffered as well. Even though Africa is home to a third of the planet's mineral reserves, a tenth of the oil, and 2/3 of the diamonds, it is still the poorest continent on Earth. Many left-wingers argue that Africa is poor because its former colonial powers want to keep it that way, not because of the choices its leaders are making. Many conservatives, on the other hand, sweepingly say that corruption or bad governance are to blame, without taking account of the obstacles many African countries face. However, according to McKinsey & Company research, Africa is outperforming many expectations and transforming its diversity into opportunities. So, let's delve into the details of how similar countries have taken diverse paths, offering valuable lessons to be learned. The first lesson, about the importance of simply having a state that works, comes from Rwanda and Burundi. Both countries are small, landlocked, and densely populated. Since gaining independence, both nations have experienced genocides against their Tutsi minorities by their Hutu majorities. In the early 1990s, Burundi had an income almost similar to that of Rwanda. However, since then, incomes in Rwanda have more than tripled, whereas those in Burundi have fallen, resulting in it becoming the world's poorest country. One significant difference between the two lies in their governance. Although neither country is democratic, Rwanda has a functional government and low corruption, whereas Burundi witnessed large-scale political strife and various coup attempts. The Ibrahim Index of African Governance, which looks at a variety of indicators including the rule of law, infrastructure and sanitation, ranks Rwanda 12th, while Burundi is placed 43rd. The second is that economic policies matter. Upon gaining independence in the early 1960s, Kenya and Tanzania had similar.
Let's look at Rwanda and Burundi. What's your reaction to that one, Benjamin?
Good day to you all. Thank you for joining us. I think the narrator there is trying to show us the comparison between the two and what is the main difference. Well, they have the similarities to say both countries do not have democracy, but one aspect that they mentioned is there is low corruption, and I think corruption is the main driver that will determine between success and failure. And as you can see, Rwanda, yes, they don't have democracy, but their corruption is low. Corruption, tends to stifle growth. A country or economy cannot grow once you have corruption. Yes, coups do happen, because of the fact that there's no democracy. Once you have democracy in your country, I think coups will not be sufficing. But the first thing that I think is the biggest problem and the main difference between the two, you will find that it is corruption.
Well, I think what maybe the narrator there, I would have said personally that the difference between Rwanda and Burundi is that while their system of government has been identical for a long time until Paul Kagame came into power, things have improved. Yes, he has stamped out corruption, and the government institutions are functioning. The only problem they have is that it is totally dependent on the leader of the day. That is one of the weaknesses that Rwanda has. Hopefully, the democratic institutions or the state institutions that he has established may survive beyond him. But the chances are the next guy who comes in, he too would want absolute power, which is what Kagame has claimed for himself. And the country can easily backslide into a failed state again, because he may end up destroying those government institutions. Corruption will creep back in. So while it is commendable that they've managed to grow, I think this is the kind of thing where you're saying, well, keep your fingers crossed. In many ways, Rwanda is like China. China, during Mao Zedong's time, was a failed nation. Millions of Chinese lived in abject poverty. But things changed 30 years ago when a more progressive, visionary Chinese leader emerged. But as we can see, with the present president, well, the visionary leader said a leader must stay in power for about 10 years. He has since sought to reverse that. He wants to stay in, he has stayed in actually for more than 10 years. Okay, things are still working. Some of the institutions, companies that were set up they're still functioning, and China is still steaming ahead, making progress. But there is no certainty that another Mao Zedong can easily emerge and he will drag the whole country back to the 1930s again. This is what I think is the problem when the prosperity of the country is dependent on an individual or one or two individuals, because it can easily change over. Let's listen to the next bit where he's talking about Kenya and Tanzania.
Similar economies, both dependent on farming, with almost identical per capita incomes. Both initially suppressed democracy to run authoritarian one-party states. But they chose very different economic models. Tanzania nationalized big companies and forced people onto collective farms in the name of African socialism, while Kenya embraced free markets, which encouraged investment and implemented several regulatory reforms to streamline foreign and local investments, including the establishment of an export processing zone. As a result, Kenyans are now 80% wealthier than Tanzanians. Zimbabwe and Botswana further reinforce this. Both the countries are led.
Well, what do you think of Kenya and Tanzania?
So yet again, we have similarities, the absence of democracy. But the only difference again here is the economies are different. One is more controlled by government, and yet the other one is more, market force driven. So which gives it a fighting chance. But yeah, I do agree with what you were saying. There is always that danger of getting the one buffoon inside, on into power, and he will just drag or just destroy everything that they have built. So basically, in the absence of democracy, you do risk that that slide back into the position that you were in before you had gained so much achievement. I think the similarities are the same in terms of how their political environment is run, but the only difference is on the economic front, where one has let the market forces do the distribution, whether it be prices or whatever, and yet one has stifled growth by commanding what direction prices should go in, or what that kind of thing. So I personally think, and I agree with you to say, you always have that. You get a good guy that comes in, but the fact that he still wants to hang on to power beyond the maximum terms allowed, you always risk falling back and then undoing everything at the end of the day.
My understanding of the Kenya Tanzania situation is that actually Kenya, whilst it embraced open market policies that encouraged competition and growth, the biggest problem that Kenya has had, I think it would have grown even faster than it did, because it has got a lot of resources and a lot of potential. But Kenya has always been dragged by the country's failure to have a proper and healthy functioning democratic system. I think we all know of the allegations of vote rigging and political violence in that country. And I think that has held back that country. As for Tanzania, I think Tanzania had the misfortune that at the formative stage, when Tanzania became its independent, although they had an idealist leader, who believed in this African socialism and so forth, he had no vision. That was one of Julius Nyerere's greatest weakness. And unfortunately, once you have created a system that is dependent, make people dependent on the state, it's very difficult to change it. And I think that has been the problem with Tanzania. Tanzania, although I think in terms of corruption, people cannot say Tanzania is renowned for being corrupt. It's not. And that's one thing that Julius Nyerere could say he left for his country. But the only problem is that he did not create a dynamic political system. It may not be corrupt, but still, Tanzania's economy has not performed at all. It's performed way below par. And comparing the two countries, actually, I think is a good idea. Why the other one is held back. And I think in many ways, if Kenya had a more competitive neighbor, it would have been galvanized into performing even better, and for the good of the people of Kenya themselves. Let's listen to the comparison between Zimbabwe and Botswana.
By very different temperamental political leaders. In the early 1980s, Zimbabwe was richer than Botswana. However, Zimbabwe's second president, Robert Mugabe, destroyed its economy through careless printing of banknotes, stealing farms for his cronies, and authoritarian rule. Whereas, Botswana's first president, Seretse Khama, embarked on an ambitious economic agenda aimed at reshaping the nation into an export-driven economy, centered around beef, copper, and diamonds. Khama implemented stringent measures to combat corruption. Consequently, Botswana now enjoys a wealth that is 9 times greater than that of Zimbabwe. Let's take a look at Africa's most successful economy, Mauritius.
Well, we won't go to Mauritius. What do you think of the comparison between Botswana and Zimbabwe?
I think this is one of the most painful comparisons that one has to do, but it should be done. Here was a country that was doing pretty good, during its time, from the early from the 1980s to the early part of, or the late parts of 1980, going backwards. The country was seeming to be doing very well, and everybody had dubbed it, to be one of the fastest growing economies in its day. But there we come decades later, like they said that, massive printing. But yes, massive printing. What drove massive printing? I think it was corruption. Corruption in Zimbabwe became so rampant that the only way to get things done was to bribe. Bribe to win elections, bribe whatever you needed to do, and it's still happening. Whatever you need to do, you have to bribe the next person to get your way. And yet, across the border, a few kilometers across the border, we find a very different economy where corruption. I mean, all over the world there is corruption, but it's very minimal. And Zimbabwe, on the other hand, if you compare between the two in terms of resource or wealth-wise, you would find out that Zimbabwe is more wealthy than Botswana. Botswana is mostly desert, right? But it's doing very well, given the facts that, this is what they have. Yet Zimbabwe has got it all, whether it be diamonds, whether it be gold, whether it be, name them, all the minerals that you could probably wish to have, they are there in Zimbabwe. But what does it show in the economy? Absolutely nothing. People are one of the most poorest in the world, probably surviving on less than that $1.90 that was being spoken about. So yeah, it all comes down to corruption. And basically, if you were to add, Zimbabwe is not a democratic country, and Botswana exercises democracy and free markets. You know, the freedoms and rights are enjoyed. Yet the opposite is true in Zimbabwe.
I think Zimbabwe has had the worst of both cases. Uh, we don't have a democratic regime, corrupt, incompetent, and tyrannical, and the democratic institutions are not there, and we don't have leadership with a vision. When you combine all those things, that explains why Zimbabwe is a failed state. When the country gained its independence in 1980, one Japanese scholar, Ken Yamamoto, said that Zimbabwe had the potential to become the South Korea or Singapore of Africa. I think if we had had a government that had a vision to establish a healthy and functioning democratic system of government, about corruption, mismanagement, and so forth, we would have become the Singapore of Africa easily. Instead, we've become the North Korea of Africa, ruled by corrupt, incompetent, tyrannical thugs who have maintained their iron grip on power through brute force and rigging elections. And they've dragged the whole nation deeper and deeper into the abyss. We are talking of, in 2 days' time, the country will be launching its new currency. Like we have said on this program, the ZiG was launched because the Zimbabwe dollar we were using at the time was already starting to grow too many zeros. Inflation was coming back. In fact, it is back. The note that is being shown there, 1 million, was not the biggest note that we printed. I think the biggest one was $100 trillion note. And that after losing about 12 or so zeros, if we were to go back to the dollar that we used soon after independence in 1980 because of hyperinflation. Zimbabwe has become the textbook case of a failed state. And at the present moment, the hope of change is not very good because the regime is able to loot so much wealth and use it to retain absolute power. And the wealth has been used to not only bribe the judges, the top brass in the police, the army, ZEC officials, and so forth, but also to bribe those in the opposition. So that now Zimbabwe, instead of having an opposition that is fighting to end the dictatorship, we have got an opposition that pretends to be fighting to end the dictatorship, when in reality, it is but the B team of ZANU-PF. The way Triple C insisted on participating last year's elections, any foreigner who would have been surprised. How can you insist in participating in these flawed elections when you know they are flawed, when you know that by participating gives ZANU-PF legitimacy? And yet they still insisted in participating. Of course, the main reason was they were after the few gravy train seats that they knew ZANU-PF was giving away to those who participate. Unfortunately for Chamisa and many of his close allies, as soon as the election results were declared and they jumped in to take their oath of office and take their seats on the gravy train, they found themselves being recalled. And many of them have since lost their seats. But that is what is at the heart of our failed political system. And I believe that Zimbabwe can still become the South Korea of Africa if we can sort out our failed political system. It's not impossible. We can do it. Benj, do you want to give your closing remarks?
So in closing, I would say, in the absence of democracy, you can see that it drives or it hinders progress or development in any country. Yes, there may be development, but it is still not sufficient. They will not reach their full potential in the absence of democracy. In the case of Zimbabwe, I think that is the main driver, the absence of democracy, which leads to the absence of accountability. And without accountability, you get corruption straight away. And this will just grow until we put our acts together. How do we put our acts together? By going back to the fundamentals. The fundamentals, the reforms. Reforms are needed. We don't have to go far and start drafting to say what reforms are, because it seems as if most of us do not get what the reforms are. My suggestion is, SADC and the other election observer missions, they have done us a favor. They have written recommendations. Let us get those recommendations implemented into our system. And I think from there, we got a platform to move forward. Yes, we can add, but I think for the primary purpose now, if we get those, I think we're on the right step. And I think, and I believe, like what you said, Zimbabwe has got the potential and will realize its potential once we get our house in order.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you very much for those who were able to join us tonight. And we'll meet tomorrow. Good night.